For years, the narrative ran that China was the coming power. Well, now it has arrived, and the UK needs a China policy that recognises this reality. But instead, for years, we've blown hot and cold. We had the golden age of relations under David Cameron and George Osborne, which then flipped to the ice age that some still advocate. The result is that, whilst our allies have developed a more sophisticated approach, the UK has become an outlier. The Chancellor and the Trade Secretary visited China this year. The Investment Minister is there right now. And this re-engagement is already delivering billions in export wins and market access.
China hasn't shifted its position, Britain has shifted its voice. Starmer is pushing for a reset with Beijing, wrapping it in language about trade, investment, and realism, but critics argue this isn't smart diplomacy, it's a strategic misstep. The logic is clear: China dangles economic incentives while steadily tightening political leverage. Once reliance sets in, the ability to challenge abuses, security risks, or Taiwan quietly erodes. That's the trap. It appears inviting, but closes the moment resistance begins. And now, the balance of power is no longer equal. China is holding the advantage.
Broadly, UK-China relations, I think, are dominated by four big sort of pillars: military, economic, cultural, intellectual, and then sort of, geopolitical kind of networks. And you would say that in all of those areas, the power has shifted decisively from Britain to China in quite a brief period of time. So in 2005, Britain had a bigger economy than China, but now China's economy is something like 5.5 times bigger than China's. In 2000, I suppose, and I was serving at the British Embassy in Beijing, we had a significant military. I mean, we had active engagement in various parts of the world, but now you would say that China is militarily quite a long way ahead. In vessel terms, I think it's got the world's biggest navy, although I know technologically it's way behind the US. Still, it's a very significant force. I think even in terms of geopolitics, Britain was a very networked, always has been a very networked nation, member of the NATO, member of the P5 on the UN. We've kind of had a big network most of our modern history. And China has tended to be quite isolated until recently. In the Cultural Revolution, it barely had any representation abroad at all. And that was only 50 years ago. Now, I think it's the other way around. I mean, China's sort of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as I understand, has the biggest network of diplomats in the world, the biggest network of embassies in the world. There's a big controversy in London at the moment with the super embassy there and whether it will go ahead or not, which I'm happy to talk about later if anyone's interested. But networks, no, I think China's got its own networks, as we saw at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization convened in Beijing in September. Finally, cultural, intellectual. Well, I think living in a British university now in the last 10 years, we always patted ourselves on the back and said this is the final sort of bastion, we'll always have advantages. I've just been writing a essay for Nature magazine, the science magazine. Research and development, China is leagues ahead now. It's our second largest research partner, bigger than France, bigger than Germany. Peer-reviewed research papers, Britain produces something like 16,000 a year, and that was only about 200 or 300 in 1999. In terms of cancer research, AI, all sorts of areas, China is really...
Does this upper hand mean China will bend to Starmer's wishes? Not at all. Just look at Jimmy Lai, a British citizen imprisoned in Hong Kong under China's national security law. His situation isn't only about one individual, it's a clear signal: China won't yield to Western pressure, even when it involves British nationals.
His verdict, he's guilty. The sentence will be coming whenever the Chinese government, but he could be sentenced to life. And why people are more interested in this is amazing. I suppose part of it has to do with the advantage that a lot of people have in trading with China. I think part of it has to do with the fact that he's an explicit Christian, which is unbecoming in modern culture, and also that he's an explicit businessman and philosophically a believer in the free market, a disciple of Hayek and Friedman and things like that. So I think there are certain things like that that might be working against him in the popular secular.
And yet, amid all this, London pushes for warmer ties. Critics warn that this approach makes the UK appear weak, signaling a willingness to trade silence on human rights for economic gains. That is exactly how leverage is established.
Why is the government kowtowing to China? Why is policy being focused on sucking up to China rather than putting the British national interest first? And why is the Chinese threat being underplayed? This all comes together in the collapse of the espionage case, which required the government to say that China was, in the terms of the 1911 Official Secrets Act, an enemy. But the government wouldn't. And the government then has made all sorts of excuses as why it wouldn't, which have unravelled one by one. It said that the offences took place when the Conservatives were in office, and that the Conservatives hadn't made it clear that the Chinese were an enemy. But it turns out that's simply not true. At the time, Tom Tugendhat, the security minister, on the floor of the House of Commons, had set out the security threat from China, and the then head of MI6 had done exactly the same. Now, the cabinet secretary at the time, Lord Case, as he has become, said that it was clear that China was a threat whilst he was cabinet secretary, and that there was plenty of evidence for this. Several respectable sources make it absolutely evident that China was and is a threat, an enemy, and a legal judgment made it clear that an enemy covered this type of threat. So why has the government failed to provide the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Crown Prosecution Service, with the evidence it needs? Well, it seems to me it's because it's in hock to China and doesn't believe that China is a real threat. But we know that's not true. We know that China is a threat. We know that China has been quietly, discreetly giving support to Russia, allowing North Korea to send troops and supplies to Russia. And North Korea is a satellite state of China. North Korea couldn't exist without the support of the Chinese, and yet both ammunition and men have been going to help the Russians in Ukraine from North Korea. So it's opposed to British Western policy in regards to Ukraine and is aiding.
Starmer's strategy is to separate economics from politics, focus on business, avoid confrontation. But China doesn't operate that way. In Beijing, the state, the party, and business are intertwined. When UK companies invest, they're not just engaging with businesses, they're stepping into China's political framework. That turns trade into leverage, and once British jobs and growth rely on it, Beijing quietly gains the power to influence UK policy. Starmer is allowing that to happen.
Clear that no transformation today carries greater consequence than the rise of China. It is a nation of immense scale, ambition, and ingenuity, a defining force in technology, in trade, and global governance. So our response will not be driven by fear, nor softened by illusion. It will be grounded in strength, clarity, and sober realism, in line with our wider international approach, and guided by our conviction that strong, purposeful engagement on the world stage is the best way, the only way in these times, to deliver growth and security.
Meanwhile, British security agencies are sounding alarms over Chinese espionage, cyber attacks, and political interference. MI5 has openly declared China a major strategic threat. Yet while intelligence chiefs issue warnings, politicians speak of partnership. That contradiction is what critics label naive, trying to embrace a power that your own agencies warn is actively working against you.
actors acting on behalf of the Chinese state engaging in activity that threatens UK national security? Yes, of course. Every day in life. I've described that today. I've described it in previous years. That will continue to be true. It's a whole series of different vectors of national security activity that we deal with. Alongside that, of course, sits a different question, which is what should the overall balance of the UK's kind of nation-to-nation relationship with China be? That one is a matter for government.
And specifically on the case that is in the news at the moment, were there frustrations to see the way that process ended for you personally?
The first thing I'd like to say on that one is how proud I am of my teams who once again had detected threats to national security and intervened and successfully disrupted threats. That's what MI5's job is, and I'm proud of the way that we did so in this case and in many others. Obviously, it is even better for us if in cases where we create a disruptive effect, if we can ensure that disruptive effect really endures and ideally creates some additional deterrent effect. And criminal prosecutions typically are the very best way of doing that. That's very often what we and the police together do across our casework, countering terrorism and countering state threats. So of course our preference always is to effect the most enduring disruption we can. When prosecutions and convictions happen, that's great. So yes, we are frustrated when those things don't happen. But this is not unique. There are sometimes reasons why prosecutions don't work. But the key thing for us to do is to disrupt threats, and that's what we've done.
The question isn't whether the UK should engage with China, it's how. Critics argue that Britain must draw clear red lines, safeguard security, defend citizens like Jimmy Lai, and coordinate with democratic allies rather than chasing short-term economic wins. Once the trap snaps shut, reopening it is far from simple. In geopolitics, the cost of naivety is always paid later. Share your thoughts in the comments. What should Starmer do next?